go. And Bill's right. I was actually born in North Carolina. My dad was a Marine. I was born at Camp Lejeune, or Camp Lejeune, as they say these days. But my parents were both from southwestern Pennsylvania, and I spent part of my childhood there, but really most of my life here in North Carolina. And Francis Hoge is kind of an interesting character. I sort of got into Francis Hoge and his story when I was doing my research on the Underwriter expedition, and many of you have heard me do my presentation on the Underwriter expedition. I've done it for your roundtable, and I've done it numerous other places. So Hoge was very instrumental, as you'll see later on, in the Underwriter expedition. And when I finished that project, I kind of got interested in some of the officers that served on the CSS Neuse. Where had they come from? When the war was over, where did they go? What happened to them? All that kind of stuff. And Hoge, to me, was always one of the two most interesting, along with Joseph Price, the third and final captain of the CSS Neuse, who was from Wilmington. But Hoge's story just was interesting to me, and I started doing a little bit of research on him. And then I got involved with Civil War Navy magazine. I had written a feature article on the CSS Neuse for Civil War Navy magazine, and the editor said, well, what else can you write about? And I said, well, I've done all this research on the Underwriter expedition. And he said, well, I already have somebody doing an article on the Underwriter expedition, but is there a story related to that you could write something about? And I started talking to him about the research I had done on the officers of the CSS Neuse, and I mentioned Hoge. And he said, I think I've got something for you. I've been talking to one of Francis Hoge's descendants, and he lives in West Virginia, and he has a bunch of Hoge's papers and a bunch of his possessions and things of that nature. Well, that was exciting to me. And so he asked me if I would write an article on Hoge, and I'll throw this up here, just shameless self-promotion. This is the fall 2019 edition of Civil War Navy magazine. There is an article on the Underwriter expedition in there by R. Thomas Campbell, who many people have read a lot of his books. And then there's also the article that I wrote about Hoge to go along with it. And this presentation sort of came out of the article that I wrote for Civil War Navy magazine. I did travel to West Virginia. I met Francis Hoge's descendant, and had a very nice visit with him and learned a lot about Hoge. And we're in the process of trying to do an exhibit about Hoge here at the CSS Neuse Museum in Kinston. Since Hoge did serve on the CSS Neuse, we opened to do a temporary exhibit on him. It was supposed to open in July, but of course COVID has messed that all up. And now I'm at the point where I'm hoping maybe next July we can open the exhibit. So that's kind of where the background on this is. So you see here Francis Hoge's picture from the U.S. Naval Academy. He looks like he's about 12 years old. And he was a very young-looking man for most of his life. Every picture I've ever seen of him, he looks much, much younger. So Hoge is born, let me see. Oh, now my slides aren't changing. Let me see if I can. Let me see why it's not letting me change slides. We didn't have that problem before.
You have to be the host.
I have to be the host. All right, Ed, you got to make that happen. Yeah, when we did the little trial run, I was changing slides, no problem. There we go. All right, thank you. So you see here, Hoge was born January 5th, 1841, Marshall County, Virginia. Now, of course, at that time, it was part of Virginia. You see the map here shows West Virginia. But I want you to pay real close attention to where Hoge is from. You know, his home county and his hometown are sandwiched in between Ohio and Pennsylvania. That little finger of West Virginia that goes up between the two states. He's less than an hour from Pittsburgh, and in fact, the hometown that Hoge was from, which was Moundsville, is right on the Ohio River. In fact, when I went up to visit Lawrence Evans, who is Hoge's son, I actually stayed in Belmont County, Ohio. I didn't even stay in West Virginia. So, you know, Mr. Evans's property is right on the Ohio River. You walk out on his back deck and you're looking about 50 feet down at the river. So you can kind of see, you know, where Hoge is from there. And it's important because I think some of you have probably heard me give a presentation on the formation of the state of West Virginia during the Civil War, which is another, you know, sort of pet topic of mine. And you can see that this area has a whole lot more geographically in common with Ohio and Pennsylvania than it does with Virginia. But at the time, yeah, 1841, this is part of Virginia. He sees the sixth of 9 children, but really there's not a whole lot else known about his childhood. He did receive an appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy September 20th, 1856. And all the documents that you're going to see in this presentation are original documents that I have on loan from Mr. Evans that I've been able to do high resolution scans so that we can use them in the exhibit. What you're looking at here is really good quality high resolution scans of the original documents that Mr. Evans still has in his possession. So he heads to the Naval Academy in 1856. And there's a series of letters he writes back to his family during his time there, and it's really kind of interesting because one of his earliest letters to his siblings back home details sort of his day-to-day life at the Naval Academy and the schedule and what they do. And it's kind of interesting. This is a quote from one of his letters that I just thought was really interesting, the way he really just laid this out so matter-of-factly. He says, "We have to get up every morning at 6 o'clock. We are waked up by the firing of a cannon and by the drum and fife. We clean our rooms and make our beds ourselves. The servant blacks our boots and brushes our clothes. In the morning before breakfast, we are marched into the chapel and then into breakfast. If I had time, I could tell you all about this establishment." That's his early view of the Naval Academy. This is his day-to-day routine. As he goes on through the years at the Naval Academy, you can tell through his letters that he becomes very, very comfortable as a rising naval officer. He really takes to it very, very well. And in fact, I think he almost enjoys some of the leisure of it. In 1859, and this would be his 3rd year at the Academy, in another letter home, he writes to his sister, "I have had my slippers made up. They feel quite comfortable and are very pretty. It is very pleasant of a Sunday morning when a person has nothing on his mind but to lay back in an armchair in his dressing gown and slippers and read letters from home." So he got really, really comfortable at Naval Academy and seemed to fit right in. I think the naval life really agreed with him. Now, he graduates in 1860, June of 1860, and he's appointed to the USS Susquehanna, which is pictured here, for cruising the Mediterranean. And that's where he is when the Civil War breaks out. He's on the Susquehanna. On June 3rd, 1861, Captain George Nicholas Hollins wrote to Hoge, and in his letter he says, "With much pleasure, I certify to your officer-like and correct conduct while under my command. Your attention to duty and your gentlemanly-like deportment is highly approved." this letter would serve well because it was almost Hoge's introduction into the Confederate Navy. And you see here Hoge's commission in the U.S. Navy. Mr. Evans, his descendant, has that framed at his house. I got to see that in person, and hopefully that will go in the exhibit as well. So when the Susquehanna comes back from its cruise and arrives in Boston, not only does Hoge resign from the Navy, but also Hollins, who wrote that complimentary letter of him. Hollins also resigns from the U.S. Navy. And they both express a desire to join the Confederate Navy, which they do. Hoge likely made the decision to leave the U.S. Navy to stand by his native state, which at that time was still Virginia. He still was a Virginian. He was appointed as a midshipman in the Confederate States Navy, June 25th, 1861, assigned to the CSS Patrick Henry. At this point in time, the CSS Patrick Henry was not yet being used by the Confederate Naval Academy as a school ship. It was just another ship in the Confederate Navy. He was only on board the Patrick Henry for 3 months before he received his first promotion to acting master, and he would continue to rise through the ranks from there. The Patrick Henry did see some action on James River in the final months of 1861, and Hoge was commissioned lieutenant in the Confederate States Navy on February 8th, 1862. So by February of 62, he's a lieutenant in the Confederate Navy, and at that point, we're on the eve of the Battle of Hampton Roads, which, of course, is just a month later. So, in May of 1862, when Norfolk is evacuated, Patrick Henry helped to remove public property from the Navy Yard at Richmond, and the Federal squadron entered the James River. The Patrick Henry moved upriver to Drury's Bluff at that point. The guns that were on the CSS Patrick Henry were dismounted and placed at Drury's Bluff. So on May 15th, the battle there, Hoge is engaged, commanding the gun that's closest to the Federal gunboats at Drury's Bluff. In fact, and this is just kind of an interesting aside, the guns that Hoge was commanding at Drury's Bluff really were engaged pretty heavily with the USS Galena. And for those of you who are up on your U.S. Marine Corps history, the first United States Marine to win the Medal of Honor was Corporal John Mackey aboard the USS Galena during the Battle of Drury's Bluff. So that's kind of an interesting aside, considering the Marine Corps birthday was just 2 days ago. Now, Hoge serves on land for quite some time at this period of his career. He remained at Drury's Bluff after the battle. He's promoted to second lieutenant in October. Here is a scan of that document, his promotion to second lieutenant. And he remains there at Drury's Bluff for quite a while. Doesn't immediately get back on a ship. However, August 1863, John Taylor Wood comes calling, and you might say, well, what, for this whole extended time at Drury's Bluff, what in the world is Hoge doing? He's commanding naval personnel that are manning the batteries at Drury's Bluff, but he's also back and forth to Richmond a lot. I found a lot of orders in the collection of papers calling him to Richmond to serve on examining boards or to serve on court-martials or to do all kinds of odds and ends, administrative duties and things like that. So for a good portion of 1862 and 1863, he's bouncing back and forth between Drury's Bluff and Richmond, doing all kinds of different things. But in August of 63, John Taylor Wood selects him as the executive officer for a raid that's going to take place on the Rappahannock River against 2 Federal gunboats. So during this attack, Hoge was in command of 2 of the 4 boats in the Confederate force. Hoge's boats were the ones that actually attacked the Reliance. The Reliance itself is sort of a small boat. I mean, you're on the Rappahannock River; it can't be too big. But the Reliance itself is a 90-ton steam tugboat converted to a gunboat. Had a 24-pounder howitzer and a 12-pounder howitzer, so it wasn't very heavily armed, really. However, during this boarding action and this fighting on board the Reliance, Hoge was seriously wounded. In fact, the quote, dangerously wounded was used by the assistant surgeon who operated on Hoge. He was shot in the neck with a pistol. The assistant surgeon, William Shepherdson, wrote to Hoge's family August 25th, 1863, and said, Lieutenant Hoge used his revolver effectively and fought bravely and coolly until shot through the back of the neck by a pistol ball. That's all the surgeon really says. But a few days later, Hoge writes a much more detailed letter to his family about the encounter, and it's interesting to note how seriously he was actually wounded. He says, I was shot through the back of the neck, the ball entering the right side just below the ear and coming out the other side. When shot, I was engaged with my cutlass with the captain of the boat. The man who shot me was not 6 feet from me and must have taken deliberate aim. It was a poor shot not to have killed me. The surgeon says a fraction of an inch either way would have killed me instantly. I have every reason to thank our Heavenly Fathers for so narrow an escape, and trust never to go into such an affair again unprepared to appear before Him. I have suffered much pain since, but I am now doing very well and have had no fever. When our forces went up, they sent me to Mr. Evans about 5 miles away so I could be safe from the parties landing from Yankee gunboats. His whole family have shown me the greatest kindness. 2 of his daughters are as pretty as any ladies I have seen in the state and have cared for me as if I had been their brother. So this really puts Hoge out of action for a while he recuperates. September 7th, John Taylor Wood, in a detailed report to Secretary of the Navy, Stephen Mallory, recommended Hoge for promotion based on his actions in capturing the Reliance and for gallant and meritorious conduct. So Hoge was promoted again, effective August 23rd, 1863. While he was recuperating. You see, once he's back in action is the first time that we see him in North Carolina. In October of 1863, Hoge is he's returned to duty as a member of the Naval Examining Board first. So they bring him back in sort of an administrative capacity. But after a very brief service there, he was assigned to the ironclad CSS Richmond. But then very shortly thereafter, he's sent to North Carolina to serve torpedo duty at the Roanoke River. You see here a copy of his orders from Colonel J.C. Ives, who was an aide-de-camp to President Jefferson Davis, as well as the entry from Secretary of War Seddon to General Whiting in Wilmington, announcing that Hoge will be coming. And the quote that the whole thing, spells it out. In Hoge's orders, it says, by direction of the President, you will enter upon the duty of placing obstructions in the Roanoke River and proceed to Wilmington to confer with General Whiting. And then Seddon sends the order to Whiting, basically saying that Whiting should give him any assistance he needs for his torpedo duty on the Roanoke River. Now, placing torpedoes in the Roanoke River, Hoge was working with the Army personnel as well as other Navy personnel. I've not located any good images of any of those operations on the Roanoke River. There is the map here you see in the center that shows the alignment of the torpedoes in the river and how they are placed. You see the sketch of the keg-type torpedo that they were using. But the photograph on the left is from the James River in Virginia. But, you know, I imagine torpedo stations all looked pretty similar, so I decided that was good enough to represent, you know, what you may have seen on the Roanoke River in the late fall and early winter of 1863 and into 64, as Hoge and the Torpedo Bureau were doing their work there at the Roanoke River. Now, as with a lot of other things, Hoge goes there and it's very short-lived. It doesn't last very long, because guess who comes calling again is John Taylor Wood, and this time it's for the Underwriter expedition. So January of 1864, Hoge is ordered to Wilmington, January 16th to be exact, to begin preparations for the Underwriter expedition. And this is I think this is where you start to see a pattern of senior officers putting more and more trust in Hoge. You know, he gets all this, you know, in 62, 63, he's getting all these administrative assignments in Richmond, doing small things. Then Hoge selects him in August of 63 to be second in command on the Rappahannock raid. Then they send him here for torpedo duty, and now they're coming back to him again for the Underwriter expedition. And with each one of these things that Hoge is selected for, you see the trust that's building in him from senior officers. And I've not really found anything from any senior officers that has anything really negative to say about Hoge at any point. He did at some point in 1863 get into some kind of a disagreement with a superior officer, and he was basically told he needed to mind his place and cool it a little bit, but he wasn't severely reprimanded. And I think throughout the war, as things progress, you see senior officers having more and more confidence in Hoge's ability to get things done. And that comes through in a big way in the lead up to the Underwriter expedition, because when Hoge goes to Wilmington January 16th of 64, he has got a monumental undertaking before the expedition even gets underway. So John Taylor Wood put together a force of 33 officers and 220 enlisted men, which included 25 Confederate States Marines under the command of Captain Thomas Wilson. The expedition was carried out in 12 boats and 2 larger launches. Each launch had a 12-pounder howitzer. And men for this expedition were brought in from all over the South. They were brought in from the James River Squadron in Richmond. They came from Wilmington. They came from Savannah. They came from Charleston. And they all converged initially on Wilmington and then were put on train cars to come to Kinston. All of the logistics of this was put in the hands of Hoge and Lieutenant George Gift. And Gift comes from Charleston and gets involved, but it's mainly Hoge who's doing a lot of this work. Hoge was in charge of selecting, organizing, and supplying the entire party for this raid. And when I say supplying, he was supposed to provide each man, and remember, we're talking about over, you know, just a little over 250 men here, blankets, pea coats, shoes, cooking utensils, axes, rifles, cutlasses, revolvers, all the ammunition to go with all that stuff, and the men and supplies assembled at Wilmington and then sent to Kinston by rail. If Hoge and Gift didn't pull this off, there's no way this raid was ever going to be successful. This is a tremendous amount of trust to be put into the hands of somebody who's still a really young lieutenant. I mean, Hoge at this point, you know, is still a very young man. but he has a lot of experience. And this I think the Underwriter expedition is really where Hoge finally makes a name for himself because of the level of trust that's given him in this action. So late in the evening of February 1st of 64, John Taylor Wood, his executive officer Benjamin Lyell, and a small crew made a reconnaissance of their target. And they determined that they would attack the next night between midnight and 4 a.m., February 2nd. And the target was the USS Underwriter. And you see here on the slide all the details on the Underwriter, 325-ton, 170-foot long, and all the armament and things to go with it. And you can see here on the map where that ship was anchored. That ship was anchored in the Neuse River, fairly near to the west bank of the river, between Fort Dutton, Fort Stevenson, and directly across from Fort Anderson. You kind of get a feel for not only the position the Underwriter was in the river, but also the federal fortifications around Newbern. The total complement on board the Underwriter was 12 officers and 72 men, so a crew of 84 men. The commander was an acting master, so that tells you how small this ship was. They didn't even have a commissioned officer as their commander. He was an acting master. His name was Jacob Westervelt. This is where things get a little murky with numbers, because even though the Underwriter has an 84-man complement, by all measures, there were not that many men on the ship when it was attacked. Acting Third Assistant Engineer Edgar Allen stated that there were no more than 40 men on board when the Confederates attacked it. If you read the Confederate reports, and you have to keep in mind, they're trying to make this look like a huge victory when it's all over. John Taylor Wood says there were 90 men on this ship. But one of the sailors that was actually on the ship that was captured during the raid says there were only 40. And so I think I have to go with him because he was on the ship. So really, it was only about half crew on the ship when they attacked. Wood's force attacks in two columns, one striking forward of the wheel and one striking after the wheel. The Marines were used as sharpshooters in the boats, trying to pick men off from the deck. They attacked at 2:30 a.m. February 2nd, and from the very beginning of this thing, it was very, very intense hand-to-hand fighting. It was a very rainy night. The weather was horrible. So, the deck was wet. It was slick. It was just, from the time the Confederates boarded, it was pretty much chaos. But it was over in about 15 minutes. The Confederates had control of the ship very, very quickly, even though it was very fierce hand-to-hand fighting. Now, the whole idea was to capture the Underwriter and bring her back upriver to Kinston and use it in consort with the CSS Neuse to attack Newbern. But once they captured the ship, they realized that there wasn't enough fire in the furnace to get the boiler up and running, get the engines up and running, that it was going to take some time to move that ship. And before they had time to really even think about it, the federal fortifications on shore realized what was happening. They heard all the commotion, they heard all the firing and everything, and they realized that the Underwriter had been captured. And so the forts opened fire on the Underwriter to try to prevent her from being captured. It's at this point that Wood and his officers decide they're not going to be able to move this ship. They're just going to have to scuttle it. They're going to have to set it on fire and scuttle it. This single action is what really cements Hoge's reputation. Hoge was one of the first people to board the Underwriter, and he was the one that was tasked with setting fire to it when they decided to scuttle it. Benjamin Lyell, the executive officer on the expedition, said, "The duty of setting fire to the Underwriter had been assigned to Lieutenant Hoge, a talented young officer of fine attainment and undaunted courage." So Hoge sets the fire on the ship, and he gets off and he rows back out to where the rest of the Confederates have retreated to. He pulls up alongside Wood, and he relayed to Wood that the ship was on fire. Wood wasn't certain. Wood orders Hoge to go back to the ship a second time and set more fires on the ship to ensure its complete destruction. Now think about this. The Underwriter is already on fire, and Hoge's being sent back a second time to set more fires to it. In Lyell's report, his quote is very, very simple. It's right up here on top of the slide. "Here was trying duty to perform." But Hoge performed it very well. He went back to the ship, set more fires, rowed back to the rendezvous point, and eventually, when the fires got to the powder magazine, the Underwriter exploded and sank. The Confederates rowed hastily back upriver. They found a spot along the river to bury their 5 dead, and they returned to Kinston, and most of those men were returned to their previous duty stations. And I say most, because a lot of the officers that were on the Underwriter expedition stayed in Kinston and became officers on the CSS Neuse, because the CSS Neuse was only about 2 months away from completion. So Hoge is one of the officers that gets detailed to the CSS Neuse. He's assigned as executive officer, second in command aboard the CSS Neuse, under Lieutenant Benjamin Lyell. Now, you'll remember Benjamin Lyell had been the executive officer on the Underwriter expedition. At the time of the Underwriter expedition, the CSS Neuse was being commanded by William Sharp. Sharp was transferred to Charleston to the Naval Ordnance Department, and Benjamin Lyell was left in Kinston to command the CSS Neuse, with Hoge as his second. The only problem with that was Lyell did not want to be in Kinston. Prior to coming to North Carolina, Lyell had been the commandant of midshipmen aboard the Confederate States Naval Academy. Lyell wanted to go back to Richmond. He wanted to go back to the academy, to his previous post, but he was ordered to take command of the CSS Neuse, which he did. And he was the one in command of the CSS Neuse on April 22nd, 1864, when it was launched and promptly run aground. Now, if you read any of Lyell's correspondence while he's here in Kinston, he's entirely frustrated. He doesn't want to be here. His superiors had to have been very, very tired of his whining and complaining, but he was at the helm when the CSS Neuse ran aground. And they ran it aground hard, so hard they couldn't get it off the sandbar. They had to wait a month for the river to rise enough to refloat it. Needless to say, Lyell gets his wish. He's sent back to Richmond, and in August of 1864, the man you see here in the picture, Joseph Price, takes command of the CSS Neuse. Price, as I said earlier, is from Wilmington. He's the third and final commander of the CSS Neuse. Now, Hoge's career in the Confederate Navy perished along with the CSS Neuse in March of 1865. On March 8th, 9th, and 10th, 1865, the Battle of Wise Fork was fought on the outskirts of Kinston. And when the Confederates made the decision to evacuate Kinston, which was completely the correct decision, you can't really question the decision to evacuate and leave Kinston, because had they stayed here, not only would they have the federal forces under Jacob Cox in front of them, but Sherman's army would have been behind them in Goldsboro, and that was a no-win situation. They had to get the army out of Kinston so that it could fight another day. And you're talking about 2 divisions. You're talking about Robert F. Hope with the division and D.H. Hill with the division. They couldn't sacrifice that to try to keep Kinston. So the order's given to evacuate, and the CSS Neuse steams downriver to hold off the Union Army while the evacuation is taking place. And on March 12th, once that was finished, the crew gathered their personal effects, set fire to the ship, and scuttled it in the Neuse River. I won't go into a lot of detail about what they did between then and the end of the war because I want to get to the end of Hoge's story here pretty quickly. Hoge was paroled on May 11th at Macon, Georgia, and very, very quickly proceeded to Halifax, Nova Scotia, along with a lot of other former Confederate officers, including his old friend John Taylor Wood. Hoge stayed in Nova Scotia for 5 years, roughly 5 years or so. He and John Taylor Wood actually were partners in a brickyard operation. And the photo you see here was a photo that I found in the collection of documents that are on loan from Mr. Evans. This photograph in real life is extremely small. It's not much bigger than a wallet-sized photograph, but it was tucked in a letter. This is the envelope that it was in, and it's tucked inside a letter in this envelope. One of the men in that picture is Hoge, but he doesn't identify who the rest of those men are. I can only assume that they are other former Confederate naval officers that fled to Nova Scotia with he and Wood. Not entirely sure. And it's hard to tell which one is Wood, but I'm pretty sure he's one of the ones one of the two in the middle, seated in the middle, because those are the two that bear any kind of resemblance to him at all in any of the other pictures I've seen. So I really, really wish he had identified the men in this picture, because I bet it would be really interesting to know who they were. Letters home suggest that he really missed his family and he wanted to come back to the States. But of course, when he comes back in 1870, he's not coming back to Virginia. He's coming back to a new state of West Virginia. You see on the state flag here, the state of West Virginia was admitted to the Union June 20th, 1863. If you're interested in how West Virginia became a state, there's a brand new book that was published this summer about that. It's called Seceding from Secession. It's by Eric Wittenberg and 2 other authors. And I also do a presentation on that as well. So if you really want to know about West Virginia, I can tell you about that sometime. But so Hoge returns to Wheeling, West Virginia in 1870, Wheeling being the closest large city to where he was from. And when I say close, it's really very close. It's just 5 or 10 minutes up the road. And he goes in real estate with his brother William. So that's, you see the letterhead here for he and his brother and their real estate business. Aside from real estate, he was also involved in insurance. He was also involved in surveying. In fact, Hoge in 1883 was part of the team that surveyed the state line between West Virginia and Pennsylvania. So he was involved in a lot of different things: real estate, insurance, surveying. But most importantly, his biggest accomplishment after the war was that he was the city engineer for the city of Wheeling from 1881 to 1895. So for 14 years, he served as city engineer. And his greatest achievement as a civil engineer was the design and completion of the Main Street Bridge that you see in these pictures. This is the picture on the left is the construction of the Main Street Bridge in 1891. And then there's a modern picture of the Main Street Bridge, which is still there all this time later. That bridge allowed the crossing of Wheeling Creek between downtown Wheeling and the other section of Wheeling. You know, Wheeling is split by this creek. So this was the bridge that allowed the 2 parts of Wheeling to be connected, and Hoge was the one who designed and engineered that bridge. So in 1895, Hoge retired, and he lived about 6 more years. On March 16th, 1901, he collapsed during his evening walk and died shortly thereafter. He was 60 years old. Cause of death was determined to be heart disease. And he was buried, you see his stone there in Greenwood Cemetery in Wheeling. You see a couple of things here in the photographs. His sword And this shadow box, these are things that are in Mr. Evans's possession that I hope will go into the exhibit next year when we do it. This is, in fact, Hoge's sword, and these are all his possessions. This is his, in the shadow box is his commission in the Confederate States Navy. One of his shoulder boards, his pistol, and his powder flask. There are a couple of other artifacts that Mr. Evans has that are, Hoge artifacts. So it's amazing that Mr. Evans has been able to hold on to all this stuff. And Mr. Evans' mother was a Hoge. That's how he came to have these things. Francis Hoge himself never married, never had children. So Mr. Evans is descended from William Hoge's children, William being Francis's older brother. So the line of descendants does not come straight from Francis himself, but rather from his brother William, for those family that are still around. Now, upon receiving word of Hoge's death, John Taylor Wood, who was very much still alive and still living in Nova Scotia, wrote a letter of condolence to the Hoge family. Yet another artifact that I'm very much looking forward to putting in this exhibit for people to see. But as part of that letter, I think, and this is where I get the title for the presentation, John Taylor Wood summed up Francis Hoge in one sentence, and that sentence was, "At all times and under all circumstances, he could be depended upon as an able and true officer." So that is the life and career of Francis Hoge. And let's see, I can take questions now. Let's see, there's something in the chat. Did Hollis influence Hoge to resign and join the Confederacy? I don't find any evidence of that. I think the two of them were determined to resign when they returned from their cruise, because they were both Southerners, and as many other Southern officers did, they resigned and went with their home states. My God, most of the officers on the CSS Neuse have a similar backstory. Lyell had been in the U.S. Navy for a long time. He was much older than Hoge. For a long time prior to the war. Richard Bako from Charleston had been a midshipman at the academy the same time as Hoge. He resigned and went back to South Carolina. Joseph Price, interestingly enough, from Wilmington, didn't have a U.S. Navy connection, but he had been in the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service prior to the war, precursor to the Coast Guard. And his first Confederate service was not in the Navy either. He actually served in a Confederate artillery unit before getting into the Navy. So they all had previous backstory. How close to Fort Branch were those torpedoes set? That's a good question. As far as geographic location in the river, I'm not exactly sure where Hoge was working at that particular point in time. I'm not really sure how close to Fort Branch those would have been exactly. I got a lot of people that know more about that area of the state up that way. I'll have to ask around and see if they know. And again, Hoge wasn't there very long. He probably didn't even realize where he was before he was moved out of there and back to Wilmington. Did Hoge know Cushing at the Naval Academy? I'm not sure. It's possible. They were certainly there at the same time. I didn't see any mentions in any of Hoge's letters about Cushing. He didn't really mention other people much at all in his letters. Usually, his letters were more about daily routine and what we do here and what we do there, kind of thing. But the Naval Academy wasn't that big. I'm sure it's possible that they knew each other. What type of revolver is that? It's some kind of a pocket pistol, but I'm not 100% sure what type. I don't believe that was an issued pistol. I'm almost positive it was a private purchase pistol. And most officers did purchase pocket pistols of that nature, just because they were smaller and easier to carry around. I want to say that's a 31 or 32 caliber pistol, as opposed to the standard Colt Navy, which was 36. But I haven't looked at it closely enough to know exactly what it is. Did Hoge indicate any dissatisfaction with torpedo duty because it was so unconventional? He never really wrote anything about torpedo duty. It's interesting because at that point in the war, he's not writing a whole lot. He writes a lot in 62 and early 63, but there's a huge gap in his letters from like mid 63 up until the end of the war. He really doesn't write a whole lot, and nothing he writes really talks about his torpedo duty. And again, he was not there very long. At that point in time, when he comes back from his recuperation in October, he bounces around like a pinball for a couple of months until he lands in Wilmington in January of 64. Let's see. Got another one coming in here. Okay, did he have any effects from wound later in life? It does not appear that he did. There's nothing to indicate that his wound hindered him in any way, or once he recuperated, he never mentioned it again. As near to death as everybody said that he was, after those initial letters, he never really mentioned it again, never brought it up. And based on his performance throughout the rest of the war and the rest of his life, it doesn't appear that that really affected him at all. What was the issue that caused Hoge to be told to cool it? The details on that are sketchy, but he got into some kind of a disagreement with oh gosh, the commander of the North Atlantic blockading squadron at the time, which was Lee. He got into some kind of a disagreement with Lee over something. In all of the records that I've looked at, it's not real clear what it was, but it was a serious enough disagreement that Lee felt he was being insubordinate and brought it to the naval authorities in Richmond. And they investigated it, and they basically wrote Hoge a letter and said, we appreciate that you have strong opinions about this, but you need to take command from your officers and basically shut up, is what they told him. That's kind of where it ended. He was not formally reprimanded or anything like that. He just got a letter telling him he needed to cool it. And so I am curious. I really do want to know what it was that he had such a disagreement over. But it just, there's not enough in the records that I saw to really figure out what that was all about. Do we know how many former Confederates went to Nova Scotia? I'm sure I could find that somewhere. I don't know it off the top of my head. A lot of former Confederates did go to other parts, Nova Scotia, various parts of Central and South America, the Caribbean, some to England, other places in Europe. Particularly naval officers, you know, a lot of the crew of the CSS Shenandoah. We just had that anniversary, too, of the Shenandoah striking their flag in November '65. A lot of them were very, very fearful that they would be prosecuted as pirates, and so they stayed in England. They didn't want to come back and face potential prosecution. A lot of those naval officers that went to Nova Scotia sort of felt the same way. They weren't sure how they would be treated, if they would be tried for treason or whatnot. So they just decided not to come back to the country right away. And some of them never did come back to the country. Some, after a few years, did, like Hoge. I mean, he was in Nova Scotia for 5 years. But some of them never did come back. But as far as total numbers of former Confederates in Nova Scotia, I'm sure there's a figure somewhere. I just don't know it. Any torpedoes from that time in museums? Yes, there are torpedoes. There were some torpedoes on display at Brunswicktown Fort Anderson. I don't know if they're still on display right now. We have a reproduction of a torpedo on display here at CSS Neuse. I think there's some torpedoes on display at Fort Fisher. There's a lot of places that have torpedoes on display. Any Civil War museum that would have any kind of naval artifacts, there's a pretty good chance they have torpedo-related things. And in a lot of cases, they're going to be reproduction, but there are some original things out there as well. Some at West Point, yeah. Anything like that captured, West Point, Washington Naval Yard, places like that.
Well, any more questions for Andrew?
I'm gonna turn that screen share off.
Okay, I just saw one from Jim.
Oh, is the
Gannon.
museum in Kinston open now? Yes, the museum in Kinston is open. We are open Tuesday through Saturday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And as with all other museums, we are restricted in the amount of people we're allowed to have. But quite honestly, that doesn't affect us, because the percentage that we're restricted to, our building is so large, we would never get that many people in here anyway. So, yeah, I mean, the museum here in Kinston is open Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 5. And if you come on a Saturday, you can go across the street and see the full-size replica of the CSS Neuse as well. They're open on Saturdays. So you can come see what's left of the original boat and then go across the street and see the full-size replica, which is pretty cool.
Everybody know how to use that chat function? If you've got a question, it should be, somewhere on the bottom of your screen or up on the top. And well, this was a great presentation, and it's great when lots of people have lots of questions. That indicates that it's very interesting. And if nobody else has any more questions, though, we'll let Andrew go, and he can practice his disc golf. Or
That's dark. You can't do that now.
Not tonight. No. Maybe. I know another one of your hobbies is researching and enjoying beer. So maybe you can do some research on the beer front tonight.
No, that's ongoing. That's all the time. In fact, if you're not aware, our museum and my office is only 2 blocks from Mother Earth Brewing, our local brewery here, one of our local breweries here in Kinston. We have 2. And Mother Earth just announced they released a new beer today, so who knows? That's a possibility right there.
Well, we'll let you go, Andrew, and thank you again very much for changing your schedule, and we really appreciate it. It was a really good presentation. And
not a problem. Happy to do it.
Hey, I will put in one last word, and that's, that Civil War Navy magazine is an excellent magazine. I've been subscribing to it for a couple of years, and full of a lot of good, in-depth stories with good citations and so forth, too, to the sources and sources of the pictures and photos. They just had a great one about the New York Navy Yard, as it was called in the Civil War, the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So, well, with that,
And I have it on good authority from the editor that an upcoming issue will feature an article by your very own Chris Bonville. So,
Oh, great.
I'll have an article in that issue as well. Both of them Fort Fisher related. So that's going to be, let's see, the fall 2020 just came out a couple weeks ago. So I think it's going to be the winter edition, the next one that comes out, I think.
Okay.
Or maybe spring. It's going to be one of the next two issues. We'll have an article by Chris Bonville, and also another article by myself about a Union Navy officer.
I'll tell you what, and Sherry, I think you're still on the presentation, Sherry Hewitt, and we'll make sure we get something in the newsletter, our next newsletter, about that magazine and the upcoming articles from you and from Chris. Well, thanks again, Andrew. It's good to see everybody, even if it's just virtually. And like I said, next month, December 10th, we're going to talk about Cedar Creek, and we're going to try to do a hybrid presentation. There's only going to be, we'll be limited to 10 people in the room, but we'll go ahead and do the Zoom as well. So with that, thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ed.